wind in the Wyoming Territory did not simply blow, it scoured. It came down from the granite teeth of the Laramie Mountains with a distinct, living malice, hunting for cracks in the chinking of log walls and gaps in the heavy wool coats of men. By November of the 1880s, the grass on the high plains had turned the color of cured tobacco, brittle enough to snap under a boot heel. The horizon was a flat, gray blade that separated the frozen earth from a sky that looked like bruised iron. It was a country vast enough to make a man feel like nothing more than a temporary stain on the landscape. Silas Mercer stood on the porch of his ranch house, watching the gale strip the last dead leaves from a cottonwood tree near the creek. He was a man built of the same hard materials as the land he owned. 50 years of life had weathered him down to the essential sinew and bone. He was tall, with shoulders set in a permanent brace against the weight of the world, and a face that might have been handsome once, before the sun and the silence carved deep lines around his mouth and eyes. He owned the Mercer Creek Ranch, 6,000 acres of prime grazing land that straddled the border country where the law was often just a suggestion made by the man with the most ammunition. Silas was known in Cheyenne and Laramie as a fair man in business, which was rare, and a cold man in company, which was common. He paid his riders a day early. He kept his fences tight, and he kept his heart shut like a bank vault on a Sunday. He turned and went inside, closing the heavy oak door against the scream of the wind. The silence of the house hit him harder than the noise outside. It was a big house, 2 stories of planed lumber and stone, built 10 years ago for a future that had never arrived. It was too large for one man. The air inside was still and cool, smelling of wood smoke and the faint, lingering dust that no amount of sweeping seemed to clear. Silas walked through the parlor, ignoring the furniture that sat under white dust sheets like ghosts waiting for a resurrection. He entered the kitchen, the only room he truly inhabited. His supper sat on the cast-iron stove, a pot of beans and salt pork that had boiled down to a thick sludge. He ladled it into a tin plate and sat at the long pine table. There were 12 chairs at the table. He sat in the one nearest the heat. He ate methodically, staring at the black iron of the stove door. He did not taste the food. Eating was just stoking the engine. His eyes drifted to the doorway leading to the hall, half expecting to see the swish of a blue skirt or hear the light, rapid tapping of boots that had not walked these floors in 8 years. Mary had died in the winter of '77, taken by a fever that burned through her in 3 days. She had left him with a big house, a prosperous ranch, and a hollow space in his chest that felt as wide and empty as the range outside. He finished his meal and wiped his plate with a piece of stale bread. The house settled around him, the timbers groaning as the temperature dropped. This was his life. He worked until his body ached. He ate. He stared at the fire. And he slept in a room that still held a silver hairbrush on the vanity, untouched, gathering gray dust. 3 days later, the sky collapsed. A blizzard rolled in from the north, a white wall that erased the world. It was in the teeth of this storm that a wagon limped up the long drive to the Mercer house, the mules heaving, their chests crusted with ice. Silas watched from the window. He saw the driver, a bundled shape hunched over the reins, and 2 other figures in the back, huddled under buffalo robes. He pulled on his coat and went out, forcing the door open against the drift that was already building against the threshold. "Get them inside," he shouted over the wind. The driver didn't argue. He just pointed a frozen mitten toward the barn. Silas helped down the passengers. One was a man, coughing with a rattle that sounded like dry peas in a gourd. The other was a woman. She was small, wrapped in a coat that was too thin for this country, wearing a shawl wrapped tight around her head. When Silas reached up to help her down, her hand felt small and cold through his glove, but her grip was surprisingly firm. She did not stumble. Inside the kitchen, with the stove roared up to a cherry red, the travelers shed their outer layers. The driver was a man named Evans, who ran a transport service out of Laramie, trying to beat the storm to Fort Collins. The coughing man was a drifter looking for mining work. And then there was the woman. She unwrapped her shawl, revealing dark hair pulled back severely from a face that was pale with cold. She was perhaps 25 or 30. It was hard to tell. Her eyes were dark, watchful, and entirely devoid of the pleading look Silas usually saw in the eyes of people stranded by weather. She stood near the stove, rubbing her hands together. Silas noticed her hands immediately. They were red, the skin roughened and cracked, the knuckles swollen slightly. Those were not the hands of a lady of leisure. They were hands that had scrubbed floors, hauled wood, and wrung out sheets in freezing water until the skin gave up. "I have coffee," Silas said, his voice rusty from disuse. "Thank you," the woman said. Her voice was low. Careful. She spoke as if she had a limited supply of words and could not afford to waste a single one on pleasantries. Silas poured 3 mugs. As he handed one to her, he looked at her directly. "What is your name? Miss?" "Mrs. Reyes," she corrected him, though she wore no ring. "Clara Reyes. I was heading to Cheyenne to the employment agency." "What kind of work?" Silas asked. "Housekeeping, cooking, mending, anything that pays." Silas looked around his kitchen. His last cook, an erratic man named Pete, had quit 2 weeks ago to go prospect for gold in the Dakotas. His housekeeper, an older woman named Mrs. Gable, had been found 3 times in the pantry with a bottle of his best whiskey and had been sent packing a month before that. The house was sliding into squalor. Dust coated the mantels. The linens were graying. He was tired of eating burnt beans. He was not a man who believed in fate, but he believed in practicality. "I need a housekeeper," Silas said flatly. The storm howled outside, rattling the window panes. Clara Reyes paused, the mug halfway to her mouth. She looked at him, her eyes narrowing slightly, assessing the threat. She looked at the size of him, the grim set of his mouth, the gun belt hanging on the peg by the door. Then she looked at the chaotic state of the kitchen, the pile of unwashed dishes in the basin, the floor that hadn't seen a broom in weeks. She lowered the mug. "Does the position include room and board?" "It does. A room on the 2nd floor, private, and the wage? $20 a month." "25, she said instantly. "If I am to do the cooking as well." Silas blinked. He had expected gratitude, or perhaps fear. He had not expected negotiation. He looked at her again. She was shivering slightly, likely from the bone-deep chill of the wagon ride, but her chin was lifted. She was terrified. He realized with a sudden jolt of insight. She was terrified of him, of this place, of the storm. But she was standing her ground because she had nowhere else to retreat to. 25. Silas agreed. "You start in the morning." The storm lasted 2 days. Evans and the coughing man slept in the bunkhouse with the ranch hands. But Clara Reyes moved into the small spare room at the back of the main house. She worked like a woman chased by wolves. She was up before the sun. The sound of the iron stove grate rattling echoing through the floorboards while Silas was still shaving. By the time he came down for breakfast, there were biscuits, hot coffee, and fried salt pork that wasn't burnt. She moved through the house with a silent, ferocious intensity. She did not hum while she worked. She did not chatter. She attacked the dirt in the hallway as if it were a personal enemy. Silas watched her over the rim of his coffee cup in the mornings. He saw things she tried to hide. He saw the way she flinched when he dropped a piece of firewood into the box, a sharp, full-body jerk, her shoulders hunching up as if to ward off a blow. He saw how she would track his movements when he walked through the room, never turning her back on him completely until he was seated. He knew that look. He had seen it in horses that had been whipped too often. It was the look of a creature that had learned that pain was the only reliable constant in the world. He said nothing. He had learned a long time ago that prying into a person's past was like pulling a loose thread on a cheap sweater. You usually ended up with a mess you couldn't fix. If she wanted to tell him why she jumped at the sound of a heavy footstep, she would. Until then, he would pay her $25 a month and eat the best biscuits he had tasted in years. The house began to change. The dust vanished. The windows were washed, letting in the thin, cold winter light. The air began to smell of lemon oil and baking bread instead of stale smoke. But it was still a quiet house. They moved around each other like two planets in different orbits, careful not to collide. 2 weeks after Clara arrived, the weather cleared enough for travel. Silas rode out to check the herd in the north pasture, his foreman, Tom Brady, riding alongside him. Tom was a good man, leather-skinned and loyal, but he had the cowboy's habit of speaking his mind. "That new girl," Tom said, shifting in his saddle. "She's a worker. She is," Silas said. "Cooks good, too. The boys in the bunkhouse are jealous you got her up at the big house." Silas didn't answer. "Though," Tom continued, scratching his jaw, "I heard talk in town when I went for supplies. Someone saw her get off the wagon. Said she looks like a woman who left the Curtis household down in Laramie in a hurry." "I don't care about Laramie," Silas said, his voice hard. "She does the work." Tom nodded, hearing the warning in the tone. "Just saying, boss. A woman alone out here with a face like that. Usually trouble follows. Trouble follows everything in this territory." "Tom." They crested a ridge and looked down at the creek. The water was low, choked with ice. On the far side, Silas saw 3 riders. He recognized the lead horse immediately, a flashy palomino with a silver on the bridle. It was Jude Coulter. Coulter owned the spread to the east, the Double Bar C. He was a man of 40, smooth-faced, smiling, and ambitious in the way a cancer is ambitious. He wore a coat with a fur collar that cost more than most men made in a year. Silas rode down to meet him. Coulter smiled as Silas approached, tipping his hat. "Morning, Silas," Coulter called out. His voice was too loud for the open air, cold enough to freeze the tail off a brass monkey. "Isn't it? What do you want?" "Jude?" Silas asked, resting his hands on his saddle horn. "Neighborly visit. Just checking on my strays. Had a few wander this way. I haven't seen any Double Bar C brands," Silas said. Coulter's smile didn't waver, but his eyes were flat. "Shame. You know, Silas, I've been thinking about this creek. It runs right through the middle of your best winter pasture. My herd is growing. I could use that water access. The water is mine. Jude, my grandfather filed the claim. Claims can change." Coulter looked past Silas, toward the ranch house in the distance. "I heard you hired help. A woman. Pretty thing, they say. Seems a waste. A man like you, living alone in that museum with a pretty maid? People talk. Silas, they say you're hoarding water and women both." Silas felt a cold prickle of rage at the base of his neck. "Keep your cattle on your side of the line, Jude, and keep your mouth shut about my household." Coulter laughed, a dry sound. "You're a dinosaur. Silas, you think because you were here first, the world stops for you. It doesn't. There are ways to get what a man needs, legal ways, and other ways. Is that a threat? It's business." Coulter turned his horse. "Give my regards to the help." Silas watched him ride away. Tom Brady spat on the frozen ground. "He's got the sheriff in his pocket, you know," Tom muttered. "And that new deputy, the one with the scar, he drinks on Coulter's tab every night." "I know," Silas said. That evening, Silas went into town for the monthly meeting of the Stock Growers Association. He didn't want to go, but absence was interpreted as weakness. The meeting was held in the back room of the hotel. A cloud of cigar smoke and the smell of whiskey. The room was full of men Silas had known for 20 years. They were the respectable set, bankers, lawyers, ranch owners. They greeted Silas with slaps on the back that felt like tests of his stability. "Mercer, good to see you came down from the mountain," one man shouted. Silas took a seat near the back. He listened to the talk of beef prices and rail shipping rates. But the conversation inevitably drifted. "Say, Silas," a banker named Morgan leaned in, grinning. "We heard you finally got some company up at the ghost house." "A little Mexican girl. She's my housekeeper," Silas said, his voice level. "Housekeeper." Morgan winked at the man next to him. "Is that what we're calling it? A man your age, all alone. Gets cold at night, doesn't it?" The table erupted in laughter. It was the casual, wet laughter of men who thought they owned everything they looked at. Silas sat perfectly still. He thought of Clara on her knees scrubbing the floor, the raw red of her hands. He thought of the fear in her eyes. These men didn't see a person. They saw a joke, a commodity. "She works for a wage," Silas said, and the room quieted at the edge in his voice. "She is a decent woman. You will speak of her with respect." Morgan held up his hands in mock surrender. "Easy. Silas, we're just having fun. You need to loosen up. You're turning into a hermit up there. It's not natural." Silas left the meeting early. As he walked to the livery stable to get his horse, he passed the sheriff's office. He saw the deputy Tom had mentioned, a man with a jagged scar on his chin, leaning against the wall, talking to one of Coulter's ranch hands. They stopped talking as Silas passed, watching him with predatory stillness. When Silas returned to the ranch, it was late. The wind had picked up again, screaming around the eaves of the house. He stabled his horse and walked toward the back door. He found Clara in the kitchen. She was sitting at the table, polishing the silver. She wasn't doing it because it needed doing. She was doing it to keep her hands moving. She looked up when he entered, and he saw the immediate tightening of her jaw. "Mr. Mercer," she said, standing up. "I kept a plate warm." "Thank you," Silas said. He hung his coat on the peg. He sat down and ate the stew she had made. It was rich with herbs, savory and hot. Clara went back to polishing. The sound of the cloth rubbing against the metal was the only noise in the room. Silas watched her. He felt a strange urge to speak, to bridge the gap between them, but he didn't know how. He had forgotten the language of casual conversation. "Heard you were in town," Clara said without looking up. Did you see anyone?" Silas paused. "Who are you afraid of?" "Clara." Her hand stopped moving. She stared at her distorted reflection in the back of a spoon. "Everyone," she whispered. Silas put down his fork. "I saw the deputy. He said, the one they say takes money from Coulter." Clara looked up then, her eyes dark and terrified. "The law is just a word. Mr. Mercer. It changes shape depending on who says it. Where I come from, the man with the badge was the one you ran from, not toward. You're safe here," Silas said. It was a promise he wasn't sure he could keep, but he said it anyway. Clara looked at him, searching his face for the lie. She didn't find it, but she didn't find comfort either. "Locks break," she said softly. 2 nights later, the wind turned into a gale that shook the foundations of the house. It was a wind scream night, the kind that drove animals mad. Silas was in the study, trying to focus on a ledger, when he heard a crash from the barn. He grabbed his lantern and ran out. The wind nearly knocked him off his feet. The barn doors were rattling in their frames. He pushed inside, the lantern light swinging wildly. One of the shutters in the hayloft had blown open, banging violently against the wall. The noise had terrified the horses, his prize stallion. A massive bay named Jupiter was rearing in his stall, kicking at the wood, eyes rolling white with panic. Silas moved toward the stall, speaking low, but the horse was beyond hearing. The hooves smashed against the gate, splintering the wood. If the horse broke a leg, he would have to shoot it. "Easy," Silas shouted, but the wind drowned him out. Suddenly, a shadow moved past him. It was Clara. She had followed him out, a shawl thrown over her nightdress, boots unlaced. "Get back," Silas yelled. "He'll kill you." Clara ignored him. She moved toward the stall not with hesitation, but with a fluid, purposeful speed. She didn't shout. She didn't wave her arms. She slipped through the gap in the gate before Silas could stop her. "Clara!" She moved right up to the stallion's head. The horse reared, hooves slashing the air inches from her face. She didn't flinch. She didn't back down. She reached up and grabbed the halter, pulling the horse's head down with surprising strength. She pressed her face against the horse's neck. She began to speak, not in English, but in Spanish, a low, rhythmic pouring of words. "Calma. Chico. Calma. El viento es solo ruido. Estoy aquí. Estoy aquí." Silas watched, paralyzed, the lantern shaking in his hand. The stallion was trembling, sweat darkening his coat, but he stopped kicking. He stood there, huffing huge breaths, his ears flickering back and forth. Clara kept her hand on his neck, stroking firm and slow, her voice a steady anchor in the storm of noise. Slowly, The horse lowered his head. He blew a breath against Clara's shoulder. She patted him, hard, the way a man would, and stepped back. She slipped out of the stall and latched the gate. She turned to Silas. Her hair was wild, blown loose by the wind, and her eyes were bright with adrenaline. Silas stared at her. He had seen experienced horsebreakers fail to calm a panicked stallion. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked. Clara pulled her shawl tighter, shivering now that the danger was past. "My father," she said, "he trained horses for the army, before everything." Silas looked at the shutter banging above them. "I'll fix that," he said. "Go inside. You'll freeze." The next morning, the wind had died. Silas sat at the kitchen table, watching Clara knead dough for bread. Her movements were rhythmic, powerful. He thought about the night before, the way she had walked into the stall, the total absence of the fear she showed around people. She trusted the animal more than she trusted him. "Clara," Silas said. She stopped, looking at him warily. "Yes, Mr. Mercer? I'm raising your wage, $30 a month." Clara wiped her floury hands on her apron. "Why?" "Because you saved a $500 horse last night, and because you work harder than any 2 men I have on the payroll." Clara stood straight. "I don't need charity. Mr. Mercer, we agreed on 25. "It's not charity," Silas said, his voice firm. "It's value. I pay for value." Clara looked at him. She lifted her chin, her pride warring with the reality of her worn boots and the thin coat hanging by the door. She looked at the flour on her hands. She knew what $30 could buy. It could buy a train ticket far away if she needed to run. It could buy silence. She took a breath. $30, she said. "Thank you," Silas nodded. That evening, after the supper dishes were cleared, Silas didn't go into the study. He stayed in the kitchen. He poured 2 cups of coffee. He pushed one across the table to where Clara sat mending a tear in one of his work shirts. She looked at the cup, then at him. It was a breach of protocol. The help didn't drink coffee with the master of the house. "Sit," Silas said. "Please." Clara hesitated, the needle hovering over the fabric. Then, slowly, she set the shirt down. She wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic mug. Silas took a sip of his own coffee. The kitchen was warm. The wood in the stove shifted with a soft thud. Outside, the Wyoming night was vast and cold, full of wolves and men like Jude Coulter. But in here, in the circle of lamplight, the world felt smaller. They didn't speak. Silas stared at the table grain, and Clara watched the steam rise from her cup. They were 2 lonely people, damaged by life, sitting 3 feet apart. Their hands did not touch, but the air between them, usually so empty, felt suddenly heavy, charged with a gravity that pulled them toward the center. It felt crowded, and for the first time in 8 years, the house did not feel entirely like a tomb. The winter settled over the Mercer Creek Ranch like a heavy wool blanket, gray and suffocating. By December, the routine of the household had shifted, pivoting around the silent, relentless force of Clara Reyes. She had become the backbone of the place, though she moved through the rooms as if trying not to disturb the air. The ranch hands, men who lived in the bunkhouse and smelled of wet leather and unwashed flannel, began finding excuses to come up to the main house kitchen. They brought firewood that didn't need bringing. They came to ask about repair orders that could have waited for the foreman. They came for the coffee, which was now strong and hot and served in clean tin mugs. But mostly they came to look at her. Clara moved around them like water flowing around stones. She fed them. She poured their coffee. But she did not smile. She kept her eyes on her work, her hands busy with the rolling pin or the paring knife. One morning, a young rider named Billy, barely 18 and full of the reckless confidence of youth, leaned against the doorframe while Clara peeled potatoes. "You are too fine a thing to be scrubbing floors." "Miss Clara," Billy said, grinning, "if I had a spread of my own, I would have you sitting on a velvet cushion eating sugar lumps." Clara did not look up. The peel curled away from the potato in a long, unbroken ribbon. "If you had a spread of your own, Billy, you would need someone to cook the potatoes, not eat the sugar," she said. The other men laughed, a rough, barking sound. Tom Brady, the foreman, swatted Billy with his hat. "Leave her be, kid. She has got more work in her little finger than you have in your whole carcass." They respected her, in their way. They respected that the food was hot and the kitchen was warm. But there was an edge to it, the casual cruelty of the era. When they left the kitchen, Clara could hear their low voices through the window. Jokes about Silas and his winter comfort. Crude assumptions that a woman living in a bachelor's house could only be there for one purpose. Clara heard them, and she let the words sink into the deep, cold well where she kept all her shame. She wanted to be invisible. Invisibility was safety. In her experience, to be seen was to be targeted. But Silas Mercer made invisibility impossible. Silas had changed. The change was as subtle as the shifting of light on the snow, but Clara noticed it. He had stopped eating his supper in 10 minutes and retreating to the study. Now, he lingered. He would sit at the head of the long pine table, nursing his coffee, watching the fire in the stove, or watching her. He came in from the range earlier, too. One evening, the wind was howling around the eaves, rattling the sash weights in the window frames. Silas sat at the table, oiling his rifle. Clara was by the lamp, mending a tear in his heavy canvas coat. Silas stopped wiping the barrel and watched her hands. The needle flashed in the lamplight, weaving in and out of the tough fabric with a rhythm that was almost hypnotic. "You have a seamstress's hands," Silas said. It was the first thing he had said in an hour. Clara paused, then pulled the thread tight. "I have hands that do what needs doing." "Mr. Mercer, where did you learn to stitch like that? That is not simple mending. That is a flat-felled seam." Clara kept her eyes on the coat. "I grew up in places where clothes had to last," she said quietly. "When you are poor, a tear in a coat is a disaster. If you can fix it so it holds against the wind, you are useful. And being useful is important. Being useful keeps you inside the house," Clara said. "It keeps you fed." She bit the thread, a sharp snap in the quiet room. She did not tell him the rest. She did not tell him about the aunt in Santa Fe who would strike her with a switch if the stitches were crooked. She did not tell him that she learned to sew, to cook, to scrub, and to disappear because children who were useful were allowed to stay, and children who were burdens were left behind. Silas looked at her, his gray eyes unreadable. "You are not just useful here." Clara stiffened. She folded the coat carefully, placing it on the bench. "I earn my wage," she said, deflection rising like a shield. Silas seemed about to say something else, something that might have cracked the professional distance between them, but he stopped. He looked back at his rifle, sliding the bolt forward with a metallic clack. "I appreciate the work," was all he said. The peace of the kitchen was a fragile thing. Outside, the pressure on the Mercer Creek Ranch was tightening like a noose. It began with the calves. It was calving season, early for the high country, but Silas bred his stock for hardiness. The new calves were dropping, steaming in the cold air, vulnerable. Tom Brady came into the kitchen 3 days before Christmas, stomping snow off his boots. His face was grim. "We are down 4 head. Boss," Tom said, not accepting the coffee Clara offered. "Wolves?" Silas asked, standing up from his breakfast. "Two-legged wolves?" Tom spat. "Found boot tracks near the North Ridge. They cut the wire, drove them off toward the foothills, and patched the fence back up so we would not notice for a day or two. That is not random rustling. That is someone testing us." Silas's face went hard. He walked to the wall and took down his gun belt. It was a heavy leather rig, the holster worn smooth by years of use. He buckled it on over his coat. "Coulter," Silas said. The name hung in the air like smoke. "He is trying to bleed us." Tom agreed. "Make us look weak. If we cannot hold our own stock, the bank gets nervous." "Saddle up," Silas ordered. "Take Billy and Dutch. We are going to track them." He turned to Clara. She was standing by the stove, her hands gripping her apron. The violence of the conversation had sucked the oxygen out of the room. "Lock the doors," Silas told her. "Do not open them for anyone unless you know their voice. There is a Winchester in the pantry. Loaded. Do you know how to use it?" Yes, Clara said. Her voice was steady, but her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. We will be back by nightfall, Silas said. But they were not back by nightfall. The afternoon turned into a whiteout, snow driving sideways, erasing the world. Clara paced the house, the silence pressing in on her ears. She moved from window to window, peering out into the swirling gray. Seeing nothing, fear began to bite at her throat. It was an old fear, familiar and metallic. It was the fear of being left alone in a house that could not protect her. She thought of the men who cut fences and stole cattle. Men like that did not stop at property. If they came to the house and found a woman alone. She went to the pantry and took down the Winchester. It was heavy, smelling of gun oil. She carried it into the kitchen and set it on the table. She sat in the chair facing the door, her hands folded in her lap, waiting. The hours dragged. The wind screamed. Clara remembered nights in Laramie, hiding in a cellar while men shouted upstairs. She remembered the sound of a heavy boot kicking open a locked door. She remembered the lesson she had learned at 14. Locks were just suggestions to men who felt entitled to take what they wanted. It was nearly midnight when she heard the horses. She stood up, lifting the rifle, her knuckles white on the lever. "Clara!" It was Silas's voice, hoarse and shouting over the wind. "Open up!" She threw the bolt and pulled the door open. Silas stumbled in, covered in snow, looking like a snowman brought to life. Tom and the others were behind him, shivering and cursing the cold. They brought the cold in with them, a blast of freezing air that swirled around Clara's skirts. Silas looked at her, saw the rifle in her hand, saw the way she was trembling, not from cold, but from the adrenaline crash. He stopped, pulling his gloves off with his teeth. "You are all right?" "Yes," Clara said, lowering the gun. Silas looked at her for a long moment. His eyes were red-rimmed and exhausted, but there was a fierce intensity in them. "We found the calves," he said. "2 were dead. We got the other 2 back." He reached out, as if to touch her shoulder, then stopped himself. His hand hovered in the air for a second, then dropped to his side. "Make coffee." "Clara," he said gently, "we are frozen through." 2 weeks later, the supplies ran low. The storm had blocked the pass for 10 days, and the pantry was showing bare shelves. Silas needed parts for the windmill, and Clara needed flour and salt. "I am going into town," Silas announced. "You should come. You have not been off the ranch in a month." Clara hesitated. She hated town. Town meant people, and people meant danger. But the isolation of the ranch was beginning to feel like a prison, and she needed thread and soap. She rode in the wagon beside him, wrapped in a buffalo robe. The sky was a hard, brilliant blue, the snow blindingly bright. They spoke little. The silence between them had become comfortable, a shared space rather than an empty one. In town, Silas went to the hardware store, and Clara walked to the general mercantile. The boardwalks were slushy with mud and manure. She kept her head down, her shawl pulled tight. She was measuring out a length of calico at the counter when a voice stopped her heart. "Well, look at this, the queen of the high country." Clara froze. She knew that voice. It belonged to a man named Grady, a drayman who had delivered ice to the Curtis household in Laramie. He was a small, rat-faced man who collected gossip like other men collected coins. Clara turned slowly. Grady was leaning against a barrel of pickles, grinning. His teeth were yellow. "Hello, Mr. Grady," she said, her voice tight. "Heard you landed on your feet," Grady said, loud enough for the store clerk to hear. "Working for Silas Mercer, that is a step up from where you were, ain't it? Though I hear Mercer is a hard man, must be hard work keeping him happy." He laughed, a wet, suggestive sound. "I am his housekeeper," Clara said. Grady winked. "Sure you are. Honey, just like you were the housekeeper for Mr. Curtis, until the missus came home early." The lie hit Clara like a physical blow. It was the story Curtis had spread to cover his own sins, that Clara had seduced him, that she was the predator, not the prey. It was the lie that had driven her out of Laramie in the dead of night. The clerk behind the counter stopped cutting the fabric. He looked at Clara. his expression shifting from indifference to a sneering curiosity. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. "I will take the flower," she whispered to the clerk. "Just the flower." She paid with trembling hands, feeling Grady's eyes crawling over her like insects. "You got what you deserved in Laramie," Grady hissed as she passed him. "A woman like you always ends up in the mud." Clara walked out of the store, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She felt dirty. She felt marked. She climbed into the wagon and sat there, staring at her hands, waiting for Silas. When they returned to the ranch, Clara went straight to the kitchen. She filled the basin with water from the kettle, water so hot it steamed violently. She grabbed the bar of harsh yellow lye soap, the soap used for scrubbing floors and laundry. She began to scrub her hands. She scrubbed until the skin turned red. She scrubbed until she could feel the sting of the lye biting into her knuckles. She wanted to scrub off Grady's voice, scrub off the look the clerk had given her, scrub off the memory of Mr. Curtis's heavy, sweating weight pinning her against a wall. She did not hear Silas come in. "Clara!" She jumped, dropping the soap. It splashed into the basin. Silas was standing in the doorway, still in his coat. He looked at her hands, red, raw, steaming. He looked at the harsh yellow soap floating in the water. He looked at her face, which was wet with tears she hadn't realized she was crying. He did not ask what happened. He did not ask why she was hurting herself. He seemed to understand, with that strange, quiet perception of his, that she was trying to wash away something that wasn't dirt. He turned and walked out of the room. Clara stood there, shaking, gripping the edge of the sink. She waited for him to come back and tell her she was hysterical, that she was broken, that she was fired. He returned a moment later. He walked to the basin. He reached into the water, impervious to the heat, and fished out the bar of lye soap. He threw it into the trash bucket with a dull thud. Then he set a small, paper-wrapped package on the counter. "Use this," he said. He turned and left the kitchen. Clara opened the package with shaking fingers. Inside were 3 bars of soap. They were white, smooth, and smelled faintly of lavender. It was French milled soap, the kind rich women in Cheyenne used. It was soap that cost $1 a bar. It was soap that didn't burn. Clara held the soap to her nose, inhaling the scent. It was a kindness so small and yet so precise that it broke her heart more than the cruelty had. The invitation arrived in late January. It came in a thick cream envelope, delivered by a special courier from Cheyenne. Silas opened it at the breakfast table. He read it, his eyebrows pulling together, and tossed it onto the wood. "Trash," he muttered. "What is it?" Clara asked. She was serving him eggs, her hands now healing, though the skin was still tender. "The Cheyenne Stock Growers Association charity ball," Silas said with a sneer. "A peacock parade. They want money for a new hospital. They say mostly they want to drink champagne and pretend they are civilized." He went back to his eggs. "I am not going." 2 days later, Morgan, the banker, rode all the way out to the ranch. He sat in Silas's study, drinking Silas's whiskey, his face grave. "You have to go." "Silas," Morgan said. His voice carried into the hallway where Clara was dusting. "I do not have to do anything but pay my debts and die," Silas rumbled. "Listen to me." Morgan leaned forward. The chair creaked. "The town is choosing sides. Coulter is telling everyone who will listen that you are senile. He is saying your ranch is failing, that you have lost your mind living out here alone. He is poisoning the well. Silas, if you do not show your face, if you do not walk into that room and show them you are still the Silas Mercer who owns half this valley, the bank is going to get skittish. Your credit lines will freeze. It is a dance. Morgan, not a cattle drive. It is politics." Morgan slammed his hand on the desk. "And politics is just war with better clothes. You need allies. You need to remind the judge and the mayor that you exist." Silas was silent for a long time. Then Clara heard the heavy sigh of a man accepting a burden he detested. "Fine," Silas said. "I will go." The night before the ball, the house was tense. The wind had died down, leaving a silence that felt heavy and expectant. Silas sat at the kitchen table. He had been staring into his coffee cup for 20 minutes. Clara was finishing the dishes, her back to him. "Clara," Silas said. "Yes, Mr. Mercer? I want you to come with me." Clara dropped a spoon. It clattered loudly into the basin. She turned around slowly, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked at him to see if he was joking. Silas Mercer did not joke. "To Cheyenne?" Clara asked. "To the ball?" "Yes, as a servant. To hold your coat?" "No." Silas looked up, meeting her eyes. "As my guest?" Clara laughed, a sharp, breathless sound that held no humor. "Mr. Mercer, you cannot be serious. They would eat me alive. A maid at the stockgrowers' ball? They would laugh you out of the room." "Let them laugh," Silas said. His voice was low, but there was iron in it. "I am tired of walking into rooms alone. Clara, I am tired of them whispering about my ghost house and my empty life." He stood up. He walked around the table until he was standing a few feet from her. "I am not asking you to work," he said. "I am asking you to stand beside me." Clara stepped back, backing into the counter. "You don't know what you are asking. Those people, the women, they have eyes like razors. They will look at my hands, they will look at my dress, and they will know what I am. They will know I am nobody. You are not nobody," Silas said fiercely. "You are the only thing in this house that is real." The confession hung in the air between them. It was reckless. It was dangerous. It stripped away the employer-employee barrier and left them as just a man and a woman standing in a kitchen. Clara felt a rush of panic. She wanted to say yes. God, she wanted to say yes. She wanted to wear a dress that wasn't gray wool. She wanted to see music and light. But the fear was a cold knot in her stomach. "They will destroy you to get to me," she whispered. "Coulter, the others, they will use me to shame you." Silas took a step closer. He did not touch her, but his presence wrapped around her. "Let them try," he said, "but I will not go alone. And I will not pretend you do not exist. I will not leave you here to hide while I go play their game. If I go, we go." Clara looked at him. She saw the stubborn set of his jaw, the loneliness that he wore like armor. He was offering her protection, but he was also asking for it. He needed her strength as much as she needed his shield. She took a deep breath, steadying herself against the counter. "I have conditions," she said. "Name them. I will not be paraded. I am not a prize heifer you are showing off." "Agreed. I will not be touched like property. By anyone. Including you." Silas nodded slowly. "I would never—" and Clara's voice wavered, then steadied. "If you waver, if we walk into that room and they sneer, and you look at me with shame, even for a second, I will leave. I will walk out, and I will keep walking, and I will never come back to this ranch." Silas looked her dead in the eye. "If I ever look at you with shame, Clara, you should shoot me, for I would not be a man worth knowing." The preparation began. It was a terrified, silent rush. Clara did not have a ball gown. She had a dark blue Sunday dress, simple and severe. She spent the night altering it, using fabric from an old velvet curtain to add cuffs and a collar, transforming it into something that looked less like a maid's uniform and more like the attire of a widow or a serious woman of business. She stood in front of the small mirror in her room, practicing her posture. She lifted her chin. She pulled her shoulders back. She practiced the mask of cold indifference she had seen on the faces of the rich women in Laramie. "I am not afraid," she told the mirror. "I am stone. I am ice." Downstairs, Silas stood in his bedroom. He was wearing his dress suit, black broadcloth that smelled of cedar chest and disuse. It was tight in the shoulders. He stared at his reflection. He looked like an undertaker. He looked like a man marching to his own hanging. He adjusted his tie, his fingers clumsy. He was terrified. He wasn't afraid of Coulter or the bank. He was afraid of failing her. He was afraid that he had asked too much, that he was leading a lamb into a den of wolves because he was too selfish to walk into the dark alone. He picked up his hat. He looked at the empty space on the vanity where Mary's brush lay. "Watch over us," he thought. "A prayer to a ghost." He walked out into the hall to wait for Clara. when she stepped out of her room, wearing the dark blue dress, her hair pinned up with a severe, terrifying grace. Silas forgot to breathe for a moment. She did not look like a maid. She looked like a queen in exile, returning to claim a kingdom that had tried to kill her. "Ready?" Silas asked, his voice rough. Clara pulled on her gloves. They were cotton, dyed black to hide the roughness of her hands. "No," she said honestly, "but let us go before I change my mind." The journey to Cheyenne was a passage through a world that had been stripped of color. The sky was a low, iron-gray lid pressed tight against the earth, and the wind had honed itself on the peaks of the Laramie Mountains until it cut like a fresh-filed blade. Silas drove the sleigh himself. He had refused to take a driver. He sat on the bench seat, wrapped in a buffalo coat that made him look like a bear walking upright, the leather reins woven through his gloved fingers. Beside him, Clara sat rigid, buried under layers of wool blankets and furs. The runners of the sleigh scraped against the frozen ruts of the road, a rhythmic, grinding shriek that made conversation difficult, which was a mercy. Neither of them knew what to say. They passed fence lines buried in drifts and stands of aspen that looked like white bone against the dark timber. Once, Silas pointed the whip handle toward a ridge a mile off. "Wolves," he said. Clara looked. She saw 3 gray shapes moving against the snow, fluid as oil. They were trotting parallel to the sleigh, watching. They were not hunting, merely observing, waiting for a mistake. "They are far enough," Clara said, her voice muffled by her scarf. "They are always watching," Silas answered. He was not talking about the wolves. Clara touched the fabric of her dress beneath the furs. It was the blue Sunday dress she had worn for 3 years, but it had been transformed. She had spent 4 nights working by candlelight, her fingers cramping as she stitched. She had taken the black velvet from the old parlor curtains, fabric that had not seen the light since Silas's wife died, and fashioned a high collar and deep cuffs to hide the roughness of her wrists. She had taken the waist in, altering the silhouette from something functional to something deliberate. It was not a rich woman's dress. It did not whisper of silk, imported from Paris, or lace from Brussels. But it fit her with a terrifying precision. It was armor. She had stitched her dignity into the seams. By the time the lights of Cheyenne appeared on the horizon, a cluster of yellow stars in the blue twilight. Clara's stomach was a tight, cold knot. The town was not the rough outpost she had first seen years ago. Tonight, it was the center of the territory's power. The Cheyenne Club, where the ball was held, was a brick and stone testament to the cattle money that ruled Wyoming. Silas pulled the sleigh up to the front entrance. Gas lamps flared in the wind, casting jumping shadows on the snow. Carriages were lined up, discharging men in tails and women in silks that rustled like dry leaves. Silas handed the reins to the valet and walked around to Clara's side. He reached up. Clara looked at his hand. It was a large hand, calloused from rope and wire, currently encased in black kid leather. If she took it, there was no going back. "Ready?" Silas asked. "No," Clara said. Silas did not smile, but his eyes crinkled at the corners. "Good. Neither am I." She took his hand and stepped down. The air in the foyer of the club was hot and smelled of cigars, bay rum, and expensive perfume. It was a suffocating wall of scent after the clean, biting cold of the plains. As Silas and Clara entered, handing their coats to the attendants, the noise of the crowd washed over them. Then, silence rippled outward from the door. It was not a total silence. The music in the ballroom continued, a string quartet playing a polite waltz, but the conversation in the foyer died. Men turned, holding tumblers of whiskey. Women paused, their fans freezing in mid-flutter. They looked at Silas Mercer, the hermit of Mercer Creek, the man who had buried himself alive 8 years ago, and then they looked at the woman beside him. Silas stood tall, his jaws set in a line of granite. He offered his arm to Clara. She laid her hand on his forearm. Her grip was light, but her fingers were digging into the sleeve of his coat. "Hello, Silas," a voice cut through the quiet. It was Horace Pimsleur, a cattle baron with a ranch near the Nebraska line. He was a large man, red-faced and sweating, wearing a tuxedo that strained at the buttons. Horace. Silas nodded. Pimsler's eyes slid to Clara. He looked her up and down, his gaze lingering on the plainness of her dress, the lack of jewelry, the dark, severe beauty of her face. He smiled, but it was a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I see you finally found someone to manage the household," Pimsler said. Though I didn't know the help was invited to the gala, Clara felt the heat rise in her neck, a flush of shame she could not control. It was the word help. It was a knife wrapped in a napkin. "This is Miss Reyes," Silas said. His voice was not loud, but it carried, "She is my guest." "Guest," Pimsler repeated, tasting the word like sour milk. "Well, isn't that modern of you, Silas?" He turned back to his circle, dismissing them. A ripple of tittering laughter followed. Silas moved them forward, toward the ballroom. His arm under Clara's hand was hard as iron. "Ignore them," he murmured. "They are right," Clara whispered, her eyes fixed on a point in the distance. "I do not belong here. You belong where I say you belong," Silas said. "And tonight, you are with me." They walked into the ballroom. If the foyer had been a test, this was the war. The room was immense, lit by 3 crystal chandeliers that burned with the light of 100 candles. The floor was polished oak, reflecting the swirling colors of the dancers. The walls were lined with velvet chairs where the matriarchs of Cheyenne sat like judges on a tribunal. Clara felt the weight of 300 pairs of eyes. She knew what they saw. They saw the maid. They saw the Mexican girl with the rough hands. They saw the woman who had no family name, no diamonds, no right to breathe this air. She remembered the feeling of being cornered in the pantry by her former employer, the way he had laughed when she threatened to scream. "Who will listen to you?" he had asked. "You are nothing." She felt the old terror rising, a black tide in her chest. She wanted to run. She wanted to flee to the sleigh and drive until the horses died. Then she felt Silas's hand cover hers on his arm. He gave it a single, firm squeeze. She looked up at him. He was not looking at the crowd. He was looking at her. He was not ashamed. He looked furious, yes, but the fury was directed outward, toward her. His expression was steady. "Stand," his eyes said. Clara took a breath. She lifted her chin. She pulled her shoulders back, mimicking the posture of the grand ladies on the perimeter. She did not look down. She looked out, sweeping her gaze across the room with a calm she did not feel. She saw the sneers. She saw the whispers behind fans, but she also saw something else. Near the punch bowl, a woman in a purple silk gown was watching her. It was Mrs. Gable, the wife of the mayor, not the housekeeper Silas had fired, but a woman known for her icy demeanor. Mrs. Gable was not sneering. She was studying Clara's dress, the way the velvet cuffs were set, the severe dignity of her hair. There was a flicker of something in her eyes. Not friendship, but recognition, reluctant admiration. Silas guided Clara through the crowd. The crowd parted, not out of respect, but out of a desire to avoid the contamination of awkwardness. "Mercer," a voice boomed. It was Morgan, the banker. He was standing with Jude Coulter. Coulter was dressed in a suit that cost more than Silas's barn. He was smiling, holding a glass of champagne. "Silas," Coulter said, his voice smooth as oil. "You brought your companion. How bold." "Miss Reyes," Silas said again. "The name a weapon." Coulter bowed to Clara. It was a mockery of a bow, too deep, too theatrical. "Miss Reyes." "I must say, you clean up remarkably well. I barely recognized you without the apron." Clara looked at him. She knew this man, not personally, but she knew the type. He was a predator who hid behind a checkbook. "Mr. Coulter," Clara said. Her voice was steady, surprising even her. "It is amazing what one can accomplish when one is not being hunted." Coulter's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He hadn't expected her to speak. He hadn't expected her to have a voice at all. Silas stepped slightly in front of her, shielding her. "We are here to dance." "Jude, not to trade insults." "Dance?" Coulter laughed. "Silas, you haven't danced since '75. You will cripple the poor girl." The music swelled. It was a slow, sweeping number. Silas turned his back on Coulter, a calculated insult that made the banker gasp. Silas looked at Clara. "May I?" he asked. He did not wait for an answer. He took her hand and led her onto the floor. The space around them cleared. People watched, waiting for the disaster. They waited for the maid to trip. They waited for the old rancher to stumble. Silas placed his hand on Clara's waist. He did not hold her like a servant. He held her like something precious that he was terrified of breaking. "Follow me," he whispered. Clara knew how to dance. Her father had taught her. Long ago, in the dust of a courtyard in Santa Fe before the money ran out. She knew the rhythm. They moved. Silas was not a graceful dancer, but he was a strong one. He moved with the economy of a man used to working with livestock. He knew where his feet were. He guided her through the turn, his hand firm on her back. For a moment, the room fell away. The sneers, the whispers, the cold wind outside. It all vanished. There was only the warmth of his hand, the smell of his wool coat, and the steady anchor of his presence. Clara looked up at him. His face was close. She could see the gray in his beard, the lines of fatigue around his eyes. She saw the way he was looking at her. It wasn't the look of a man who wanted to own her. It was the look of a man who was watching a miracle. He looked at her as if she were the only source of heat in a frozen world. Her pulse hammered in her throat. The physical proximity was overwhelming. In the ranch house, they had always kept a careful distance. 3 feet of table, a doorway, a hallway. Now, there was nothing between them but layers of cloth. She could feel the heat of his body. She could feel the strength in his arm. "You are doing well," he murmured. "I am terrified," she whispered back. "You are the strongest person in this room. Clara, look at them. They are soft. You have survived things that would kill them in a week." The words went into her chest and settled there, warm and solid. He saw her. He didn't just see the maid or the victim. He saw the survivor. The music ended. Silas held the pose for a second longer than necessary, then stepped back, offering his arm. They walked off the floor. The silence was different now. It wasn't just shock. There was a grudging respect in it. They had expected a farce. They had gotten a demonstration of dignity. But the peace was short-lived. Clara needed air. The heat of the room was making her dizzy. Silas went to get them punch, leaving her standing near a potted palm in the corner. She closed her eyes for a second, trying to center herself. Then she heard the voice. It was Jude Coulter, speaking to a group of men near the buffet. He wasn't whispering. He was speaking in that carrying tone that was meant to be overheard, shame about her history. "Really, my foreman recognizes her. Said she worked in Laramie, the Curtis house. You remember the scandal? Theft? I heard silverware missing, and something about the husband. Apparently, she has a habit of ingratiating herself with the master of the house." The men laughed. "I mean, look at Silas." Coulter continued. "The man is lonely. He brings a woman like that into his home. It is only a matter of time before she cleans him out or drags his name through the mud. It is practically a profession for women of that sort." Clara felt the blood drain from her body. The room spun. The lie was out. It was twisting through the air, poisoning the water. Theft, scandal, profession. She looked around wildly. People were looking at her again, but the looks had changed. The admiration was gone, replaced by a salacious curiosity. They were looking at her like she was a dirty joke. She saw Silas coming back through the crowd, holding 2 crystal cups. He saw her face. He stopped. He looked from her pale, stricken expression to Coulter's smiling group. He understood instantly. Clara turned to the side, her breath coming in short gasps. She started to move toward the door. She couldn't do this. She couldn't stand there and let them strip her naked with their lies. Silas dropped the cups. The crystals shattered on the hardwood floor with a sound like a gunshot. The room froze. Silas walked toward her. He didn't run, but he moved with a speed that was terrifying. He intercepted her before she could reach the exit. He didn't grab her. He stepped in front of her, blocking her path, blocking the view of the room. "Look at me," he commanded. "I have to go," Clara choked out. "They are saying—" "I do not care what they are saying. Look at me." She looked up. His eyes were blazing. "Do not run," Silas said. "If you run, they decide who you are. Do not give them that power." Before Clara could answer, a man stepped out of Coulter's circle. It was Vance Sterling, a young, arrogant rancher who had inherited his father's money and none of his sense. He had been drinking heavily. He walked up to Silas and Clara, swaying slightly. "So," Sterling grinned, looking at Clara with glazed eyes. "Is it true? Are you for hire? Because I have a big house, darling. I could use a good housekeeper who knows her way around a bedroom." The silence in the room was absolute. It was the silence of a held breath before the lightning strike. Silas turned slowly to face Sterling. His face was completely expressionless, which was far more terrifying than rage. "Excuse me?" Silas said. Sterling laughed, looking back at his friends for support. "Come on, Silas. Don't be greedy. What is the rate? Does she charge by the hour or by the—" Silas moved. It was a short, brutal motion. He didn't punch Sterling. He reached out and grabbed the lapels of Sterling's expensive tuxedo jacket, slamming the man backward against a marble pillar. Sterling's head cracked against the stone. His drink splashed over his shirt. Silas leaned in, his face inches from Sterling's. He spoke in a voice that was low, calm, and cold as the grave. "If you finish that sentence," Silas said, "I will kill you. I will not challenge you to a duel. I will not sue you. I will break your neck right here on this floor." Sterling's eyes went wide. He gasped for air, his feet scrabbling on the polished wood. He looked at Silas and saw death. He saw a man who had lived through Indian wars and blizzards and years of silence. A man who had absolutely nothing to lose but the woman standing behind him. "Apologize," Silas whispered. I... Sterling stammered. "To her." Silas dragged him away from the pillar and spun him around to face Clara. "Apologize," Silas roared, the sound echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "I'm sorry," Sterling squeaked. "I'm sorry, miss. I was drunk. I didn't mean it." Silas shoved him away. Sterling stumbled and fell to his knees. "Get him out of here," Silas said to the room at large. "Before I forget that I am a gentleman." Two men rushed forward and dragged the terrified Sterling away. Jude Coulter stood by the buffet, his glass halfway to his mouth, his face pale. He had wanted to humiliate Silas. Instead, he had reminded everyone why Silas Mercer was a man you did not cross. Silas turned back to Clara. He was breathing hard now, his hands trembling slightly with the adrenaline dump. "Are you all right?" he asked. Clara stared at him. She was shaking. She had never had anyone fight for her. She had never had anyone stand between her and the world. "Take me out of here," she whispered. "Please." Silas nodded. He offered his arm. This time, when they walked toward the doors, no one sneered. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. They looked at Clara not with judgment, but with a mixture of fear and awe. She was the woman Silas Mercer was willing to kill for. They walked out into the corridor. It was a long hallway, lined with portraits of dead governors, quiet and cool. The noise of the ballroom faded behind the heavy oak doors. Clara walked until they were halfway down the hall. Then she stopped. Her legs gave out. She leaned against the wall, sliding down until she was crouching, her face buried in her hands. "Clara." Silas knelt beside her. She looked up, and the composure she had held onto for 4 hours shattered. Tears spilled over, hot and angry. "Why did you bring me here?" she hissed, her voice trembling with rage and humiliation. You knew they would do this." "I didn't know they would be animals," Silas said. "They are always animals," Clara cried. "That is what men are. They see a woman without a name and they try to destroy her. I told you I wasn't safe here. I stopped them." Silas said, "You can't stop them. You can't stop the whispers. You can't stop the lies. Everyone in that room thinks I am a whore. Silas, and you just made a spectacle of it." Silas reached out, but he didn't touch her. He pulled his hand back. respecting the boundary she had set. "I made a declaration," he said. "A declaration of what? That you own me? That you fight for your property?" "No," Silas's voice cracked. "That I honor you?" Clara stopped crying. She stared at him, her chest heaving. The hallway was dim, lit only by a gas sconce further down. Silas took a breath. He looked at his own hands, then at hers. She was wearing the black cotton gloves. "May I?" he asked softly. Clara looked at him, confused, exhausted, her heart raw. She gave a tiny, jerky nod. Silas reached out and took her right hand. He didn't pull her toward him. He leaned forward. He pressed his forehead against the back of her gloved hand. He stayed there, bowed before her in the quiet hallway. It was a gesture of submission, not dominance. It was an act of reverence. "I wanted you here," Silas said, his voice muffled against her hand. "Because I am proud of you, because when I look at you, I don't see the past. I see the only person who has ever made my life make sense." Clara felt a shock go through her. She looked at the top of his head, at the gray hairs mixed with the dark. She felt the heat of his forehead through the cotton. "Silas?" she whispered. He lifted his head. His eyes were dark, full of a fierce, terrifying need. "I want you." "Clara," he said. He said it plainly, without poetry. "I want you in my life. I want you in my house. I want to wake up and know you are there. And yes, I want to touch you. I have wanted to touch you for months." Clara's breath hitched. The confession hung between them, naked and dangerous. "But I will not," Silas continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I will not take what you do not give. I will not be another man who forces his will on you. If you want to leave tonight, I will drive you to the train station. I will give you the money you need. You will never see me again." Clara looked at him. She felt the ache in her own body, a deep, hollow longing that she had buried under layers of work and fear. She looked at his mouth. She looked at the kindness in his eyes. She realized, with a sudden, terrifying clarity, that she didn't want to leave. She wanted to lean forward. She wanted to bridge the gap. "Wanting is dangerous," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Why?" Silas asked. "Because it makes you reachable. If I want you, you can hurt me." Silas didn't move. He didn't promise not to hurt her. He knew that life was full of hurt. "Then we will be reachable together," he said. Clara looked at him for a long heartbeat. Then, slowly, she turned her hand over in his grip. She laced her fingers through his. "Take me home, Silas," she said. He stood up, pulling her with him. He didn't kiss her. The moment was too fragile for that, but the way he held her hand as they walked toward the cloakroom was a vow in itself. They retrieved their coats in silence. The valet brought the sleigh around. As Silas was helping Clara into the sleigh, a figure stepped out of the shadows near the corner of the building. It was a man, huddled in a cheap coat, a flat cap pulled low over his eyes. He had been smoking a cigarette, watching the wealthy patrons leave. He froze when he saw Clara. He dropped the cigarette. Clara didn't see him. She was looking at Silas, but the man saw her. He saw the profile he had known in Laramie. He saw the woman who had fled in the night. Well, the man whispered to himself, a slow, ugly grin spreading across his face. He watched the sleigh pull away into the dark, swirling snow. He memorized the face of the man driving. He memorized the direction they were heading. Recognition hardened into intent. He stepped on the cigarette, crushing it into the snow. "Found you," he said. The silence that followed the Cheyenne ball was not the peaceful quiet of winter. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a held breath. The story of what happened on the dance floor did not stay in the ballroom. It traveled on the wind, carried by telegraph wires and barroom chatter, twisting and hardening as it moved until it became a weapon. By the time Silas and Clara returned to the ranch, the truth had been stripped away. In the town of Granite Creek, the gossip had calcified into a new, ugly reality. They said Silas Mercer had lost his mind. They said he had been bewitched by a woman of low character. They said the woman, Clara, was a known thief from Laramie who had fled after seducing her previous employer. The nuances of the evening, Silas's defense of her honor, the dignity of her bearing, were lost. People preferred the scandal because it was easier to digest than the idea that they had been wrong. At the ranch, the atmosphere shifted from routine to siege. Clara felt it in the way the air seemed to vibrate with unseen threats. She stopped sleeping soundly. Every night, after the house was dark, she would drag a heavy oak chair from the corner of her room and wedge it under the doorknob. She did it quietly, ashamed of the instinct, her hands trembling as she set the legs against the floorboards. It was a habit she had learned years ago in boarding houses where the locks were flimsy, a physical manifestation of the belief that safety was something you had to build yourself, every single night. Silas heard the scrape of the chair legs against the wood floor one night as he passed her door on his way to his own room. He paused, his hand hovering over the wall, his heart twisting with a mixture of rage and sorrow. He did not knock. He did not tell her it was unnecessary. He knew that for Clara. The chair was the only thing that allowed her to close her eyes. Instead, he increased the security of the ranch. He spoke to Tom Brady, his foreman, in the gray light of dawn. "Double the night watch," Silas said, watching his breath steam in the freezing air. "2 men on the north ridge, 2 near the barns. Rotate them every 4 hours. I want rifles cleaned and loaded, not leaned against the wall to rust." Tom nodded, shifting a piece of straw from one side of his mouth to the other. "The boys are edgy. Boss, they hear things in town." "Let them hear," Silas said. "But tell them if I catch anyone sleeping on watch, they are walking back to Texas." This was not melodrama. This was the West. And Silas knew that weakness was a scent that drew predators. The Mercer Creek Ranch had to look like a fortress. The escalation began 3 days later. It started with a fire, a haystack near the south barn, dry as tinder. Went up in the middle of the night. It wasn't lightning. The sky was clear and full of stars. It was coal oil and a match. The orange glow lit up the horizon, waking the ranch hands who scrambled with buckets and wet blankets. Shouting over the roar of the flames, they saved the barn. But 5 tons of winter feed were reduced to black ash. The next morning, they found the fence line cut near the creek. Not just cut, but the wire spooled up and stolen. The posts chopped down. And near the watering trough in the lower pasture, Silas found a dead calf. It hadn't been killed by wolves. Its throat had not been torn. It lay stiff in the frost, foam around its mouth. Silas knelt by the animal, touching the white foam with a gloved finger. "Arsenic," he said flatly. Tom Brady stood behind him, looking grim. "They poisoned the water?" "They tried. The water is running too fast for it to settle. But the calf drank from a puddle where they dumped it." Tom spat on the ground. "It is Coulter. It is Coulter." Silas agreed. "But he is careful. He leaves no tracks." In the bunkhouse, the mood turned sour. The men were tired, cold, and on edge. And inevitably, the blame began to drift toward the house. "It is since she came here," one of the older hands muttered over breakfast, loud enough for Clara to hear through the open kitchen window. "We never had trouble like this before. She is bad luck, a woman like that. She draws trouble like rot draws flies." Clara stood by the stove, her hand gripping the handle of the skillet until her knuckles turned white. The injustice of it burned in her throat. But the terrible thing was that she believed them. The logic of the victim is a twisted thing. She had been told for so long that she was the cause of her own misfortune that she had begun to internalize it. "I am poison," she thought, staring at the frying bacon. "I go to Laramie, and the house is ruined. I come here, and the barns burn." Her past, which she had kept guarded in careful fragments, began to surface in her mind with brutal clarity. She remembered the house in Laramie. She remembered Mr. Curtis, a man who attended church every Sunday and donated to the orphanage. She remembered how he had cornered her in the linen closet, his whiskey breath hot on her face, his hands heavy and wet. She remembered fighting him, the scratch she had left on his cheek, the vase she had broken over his head. And she remembered the aftermath. He hadn't fired her. He had destroyed her. He had gone to the sheriff and his friends and told them she was a thief, a hysteric, a woman of loose morals who had tried to blackmail him. because he was a wealthy merchant and she was a maid with a Spanish name. His lie became history, and her truth became a scandal. She carried that shame like a stone in her pocket. It wasn't hers, but she was the one who had to lug its weight. That afternoon, the sky turned the color of a bruise. The wind picked up, swirling the loose snow into devils that danced across the yard. Clara went out to the clothesline behind the house. She needed to bring in the sheets before the weather turned. She was fighting with a frozen clothespin when the whiteout hit. It didn't come gradually. It dropped like a curtain. One moment she could see the barn. The next, the world was a swirling vortex of white. The wind hit her with the force of a physical blow, knocking the breath from her lungs. She grabbed the basket, disoriented. The house was only 50 yards away, but in a Wyoming whiteout, 50 yards might as well be 50 miles. Clara turned, shielding her eyes. She took a step and stumbled. The ground was gone. There was no up, no down. Only the screaming wind and the stinging ice that felt like needles on her skin. She panicked. She dropped the basket and ran toward where she thought the back door was. She ran into a fence post that shouldn't have been there. She had turned around. She was heading toward the open range. "Help!" she screamed, but the wind tore the word from her mouth and shredded it. She kept moving, her skirts heavy with snow, her hands freezing rapidly. The cold was a living thing, seeking the heat of her blood. She fell again, her knees striking hard earth. She curled into a ball. The instinct to sleep, the deadly, seductive sleep of hypothermia, tugging at her eyelids. "I am weak," she thought bitterly. "I am weak, and I am dying, and I will just be another frozen thing found in the spring." Then, something gripped her arm. It was not a gentle grip. It was a vice. A hand yanked her upward, dragging her out of the snow. She looked up, blinded by ice, and saw a dark shape looming over her. It was Silas. He had tied a rope around his waist, the other end secured to the porch railing. He was shouting something, but she couldn't hear him. He pulled her against him, wrapping his heavy coat around her, and began to haul them both back along the rope line. They stumbled through the white void, fighting for every inch, until the dark bulk of the house appeared out of the snow. They crashed through the back door and collapsed onto the kitchen floor. Silas kicked the door shut and threw the bolt. The silence of the room was shocking after the roar outside. Clara lay on the floor, gasping, shivering so violently her teeth clacked together. Silas scrambled up, shedding his coat. He grabbed the blankets from the bench and threw them over her. "You foolish woman!" Silas shouted, his voice cracking. "What were you doing out there? The sheets!" Clara stammered, her lips blue. "Damn the sheets!" Silas roared. He was furious, his face pale with terror. "Do you think I care about laundry? You could have died. Clara, you were walking toward the canyon." He knelt beside her, his anger evaporating as he saw the state of her. Her hands were waxen, the fingers stiff. He grabbed her hands. They were like ice. He unbuttoned his flannel shirt and pressed her frozen hands against the bare skin of his chest, under his arms, where the heat was greatest. Clara gasped at the contact. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears leaking from her eyes. "I'm so sorry. I'm weak. I'm just weak." Silas looked down at her. His hair was wet with melting snow, his beard dripping. He looked wild and terrified and fiercely alive. "You are not weak," he said, his voice rough. "You are freezing. There is a difference." He held her there, rocking her slightly. He rubbed her arms through the blankets. He spoke to her, not as a master speaks to a servant, but as a man speaks to the only thing in the world he is afraid to lose. "Breathe," he commanded gently. "Feel the heat. I have you. I have you." Clara looked at him. She felt the warmth of his skin against her palms, the steady thud of his heart beneath her fingertips. The defenses she had built, the walls of propriety, of class, of fear, began to crumble. She wasn't just a problem to be solved. She wasn't just a housekeeper to be managed. She was real to him. Desire, sharp and sudden, rose up alongside the fear. She wanted to burrow into him. She wanted to stay in this kitchen, on this floor, with this man who roared at storms for her. Silas saw the look in her eyes. He saw the shift. He held her gaze for a long moment, the air between them charged with the smell of wet wool and ozone. Then, slowly, he withdrew her hands from his shirt, though he kept them clasped in his own. "Can you feel your fingers?" he asked hoarsely. "Yes," Clara whispered. "Good." Silas stood up, his legs shaking slightly. "I will get the brandy." In the days that followed, the dynamic in the house changed. The formality evaporated. They ate their meals together at the table, not in silence, but in a quiet companionship that felt more intimate than conversation. One evening, Silas told a story about a horse he had tried to break 20 years ago, a roan mare that had thrown him into a cactus patch. Clara laughed. It was a rusty sound, surprised out of her, but it made Silas smile, a genuine shifting of his features that took 10 years off his face. They would catch each other looking, long, weighted glances across the room. Silas would watch her reading by the fire, the light playing on her high cheekbones. Clara would watch him working at his desk, the way his brow furrowed when he did the accounts. The looks said what their mouths could not yet risk. "I see you. I want you. I am afraid," but the world outside would not leave them be. A week after the storm, Clara had to go to town. The medical supplies for the ranch were low, and Silas had hurt his shoulder during the rescue in the snow. He needed liniment, and they were out of coffee. "I will go," Silas said, rubbing his shoulder. "You can barely lift your arm," Clara said firmly. "I will take the buckboard. It is daylight. The weather is clear. I will be quick." Silas didn't like it, but he couldn't drive the team with one good arm. "Take a rifle," he said, "and go straight to the mercantile and back. Do not stop." Clara drove into Granite Creek with her chin high. She ignored the stares of the men on the boardwalk. She ignored the way Mrs. Gable crossed the street to avoid walking near her. She went to the store, bought the supplies, and walked out with her packages. She was loading the buckboard when a shadow fell over her. Well now, if it isn't the little bird that flew the coop. Clara froze. She knew that voice. It wasn't Jude Coulter. It wasn't the gossip monger Grady. She turned slowly. Standing by the alley mouth was a man named Dawson. He had been the stable master at the Curtis house in Laramie. He was a big man with a face like a slab of raw meat and eyes that were too small for his head. He was the man who had seen her leaving the ball in Cheyenne. "Dawson," Clara said, her voice steady despite the ice in her veins. "Mister, Curtis was real unhappy when you left." "Clara," Dawson said, stepping closer, "he felt you owed him. He felt you stole from him. I stole nothing. You stole his reputation." Dawson sneered. "And now I hear you are up here, ruining another good man, playing the lady." He moved fast. He grabbed her arm, pinning her against the side of the wagon. The street was empty. It was the lunch hour, and the wind was keeping people indoors. "Let me go," Clara hissed, struggling. Dawson laughed. He smelled of stale beer and violence. "I think you need to be taught a lesson. Clara, I think you need to be reminded of what you are, just a little Mexican stray." He raised his hand and backhanded her. The blow caught her on the mouth. It split her lip. Her head snapped back, hitting the wood of the wagon. But Clara was not the same woman she had been in Laramie. She had survived blizzards. She had survived Silas Mercer's silence. She had calmed a stallion in a gale. She didn't scream. She reached into the pocket of her coat and pulled out the small, sharp paring knife she had bought at the mercantile. She slashed at his hand. The blade caught Dawson across the knuckles. He yelled and let go, stumbling back, clutching his bleeding hand. "You bitch!" he screamed. Clara scrambled up into the buckboard seat. She grabbed the whip. She didn't use it on the horses. She lashed it out at Dawson, the leather tip cracking inches from his face. "Get back!" she shouted. Dawson hesitated, looking at the blood on his hand, then at the fury in her eyes. He spat on the ground. "This isn't over," he snarled. "You tell Mercer this isn't over." Clara cracked the whip over the horses' heads, and the wagon surged forward. She didn't look back. When she pulled into the ranch yard, Silas was waiting on the porch. He saw the way she was driving, too fast, the horses lathered. He ran down the steps as she pulled up. Clara jumped down. She was shaking, but her eyes were dry. Silas saw the blood on her chin. He saw the swelling of her lip. The world seemed to stop for Silas Mercer. The sound of the wind faded. The color drained from his vision until all he could see was the red mark on her face. "Who?" he asked. His voice was terrifyingly quiet. Clara wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. "A man from Laramie. Dawson. He was waiting." Silas didn't shout. He didn't rage. He turned and walked into the house. Clara followed him. "Silas. Wait." He walked to the gun cabinet. He took out his revolver, checked the cylinder, and snapped it shut. He took a box of cartridges and put them in his pocket. "I'm going to kill him," Silas said. It was a statement of fact, like saying the sun was going to set. "No!" Clara grabbed his arm. "Silas, stop! If you kill him, they win. They will hang you. That is what Coulter wants. He wants you to lose control." Silas looked at her. His eyes were black holes. "He touched you. He hit me," Clara said, "and I cut him. I got away. Silas, please, do not become the monster they say you are." Silas stood there, his chest heaving. He looked at the gun in his hand. He looked at Clara's pleading face. He took a deep, shuddering breath and holstered the weapon. "I will not kill him," Silas said, "but I will not let him walk away." He strode out to the barn. He saddled Jupiter. He rode to the bunkhouse and called for Tom Brady and 2 other men. "Get your horses," Silas ordered. "We are going to town." They rode into Granite Creek like a storm front. Silas walked into the saloon where Dawson was nursing his cut hand and a whiskey. The room went silent. Silas walked up to Dawson. Dawson stood up, reaching for his belt, but Tom Brady already had a shotgun leveled at him. Silas didn't draw his gun. He grabbed Dawson by the collar and dragged him out of the saloon, throwing him into the dirt of the main street. A crowd began to gather. "This man assaulted a woman!" Silas shouted, his voice ringing off the storefronts. "He attacked Clara Reyes while she was loading supplies. Look at his hand. That is the mark of a coward who got what he deserved." Deputy Hatcher pushed through the crowd. He looked at Dawson, then at Silas. He had a toothpick in his mouth. "What is the trouble?" "Mercer," Hatcher drawled. "Arrest him," Silas said. "Assault and battery." Hatcher looked at Dawson. Dawson smirked, holding his bleeding hand. "She attacked me. Deputy, crazy woman came at me with a knife. I was just defending myself." Silas took a step toward the deputy. "You see her face. You see the split lip. You think she did that to herself?" Hatcher shrugged. "I don't know what goes on in your house, Mercer, but I'm not arresting a man on the word of your housekeeper. The corruption was naked. It didn't even try to hide. Hatcher was bought and paid for. And the law in this county was a rental property owned by Jude Coulter." Silas looked around the circle of faces. He saw indifference. He saw amusement. He realized then that there was no justice here. Not for him, and certainly not for Clara. He looked at Hatcher. "You are a disgrace to that badge. Careful." "Mercer," Hatcher warned, his hand resting on his gun. Silas turned to Dawson, who was still on the ground. "If I see you on my land," Silas said, low and hard, "I will not bring you to the deputy. I will bury you where you fall." He turned and walked away, his men flanking him. He felt the eyes of the town on his back, heavy with judgment and hate. That night, the mood in the ranch house was somber. Silas sat at his desk, staring at a map of the territory. Clara sat in the armchair, holding a cold compress to her lip. "We cannot win here," Silas said. "The deputy, the judge, the merchants. Coulter owns them all." Clara lowered the cloth. "Then we should leave. Silas, I can go. If I leave, if you leave, they win." Silas cut her off. "And I am tired of letting them win." He stood up and began to pace. "I am going to Cheyenne. I will hire a lawyer. A real one. Not one of these local drunks. I will petition for a change of venue. I will document the fence cutting, the poisoned water, the assault. I will drag this whole rotten county into a federal court if I have to. It will cost a fortune." Clara said, "I have a fortune," Silas said. "And what good is it if I cannot use it to buy a little truth?" Clara watched him. He looked exhausted. But he also looked alive in a way he hadn't been when she first arrived. He was fighting. "I don't want to be the reason for a war," Clara whispered. "People will die." "Silas, people are already dying," Silas said. "My calves are dead. Your reputation is dead. This isn't about you being the reason. Clara, the reason is injustice. I sat in this house for 8 years and let the world rot because I was too sad to care. I am done being sad." He stopped pacing and looked at her. He walked over to the chair and knelt down, bringing his face level with hers. "Let me see," he said gently. He reached out and tilted her chin up. He examined the cut on her lip. His touch was feather-light. "Does it hurt?" "Only when I speak." Clara said, "Then don't speak." They stayed there for a long moment, the silence thick and heavy. Clara looked at his mouth. She saw the tenderness in his eyes, a tenderness that belied the violence he was capable of. She moved. It was an instinct, bypassing her fear. She leaned forward. She brought her face so close to his that she could feel the warmth of his breath. She breathed his name. "Silas." It was a confession. It was an invitation. Silas went still, his pupils dilated. He leaned in, closing the gap, and Clara pulled back. She jerked away, pressing her back into the chair, her eyes wide with sudden panic. "I can't," she gasped. "I'm sorry, I can't." Silas froze. He didn't lunge. He didn't get angry. He slowly rocked back on his heels, giving her space. "It is all right," he said quietly. "It's not," Clara said, her voice shaking. "I want to, God, Silas, I want to, but I am afraid. If I start, if I let you, then I have something to lose, and I always lose everything." Silas looked at her with a profound, aching sadness. "You are not going to lose me," he said. "You don't know that. I know that I am a stubborn man," Silas said. "And I know that this feeling, this desire, it is becoming a physical pain. Clara, I won't lie to you. It hurts to be this close and not touch you." Clara looked down at her hands. "But," Silas continued, "I can bear the pain. I cannot bear you being afraid of me. So we will wait. I want your honesty. Clara, not your perfection, and not your submission. I want you to come to me when you are ready to stay." Clara looked up, tears shining in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. The next morning, the war arrived on paper. A rider from the county court rode up to the porch. He didn't dismount. He handed a folded document to Tom Brady and rode off without a word. Tom brought the paper into the kitchen where Silas and Clara were drinking coffee. "It is a summons." "Boss," Tom said, his face pale. Silas took the paper. He unfolded it. He read it in silence, his face turning to stone. "What is it?" Clara asked, dread curling in her stomach. Silas laid the paper on the table. "I am being sued," he said, "for cattle theft. Coulter claims the calves we found were his, and that I altered the brands." "That is a lie," Clara cried. "It gets worse," Silas said. He pointed to a paragraph at the bottom of the page. "Witness testimony provided by Mr. A. Dawson and Mr. J. Coulter asserts that the defendant, Silas Mercer, is acting under the undue influence of a woman of ill repute. 1. Clara Reyes, a known liar and confidence trickster, whose presence on the property constitutes a moral hazard." Clara stared at her name. It was there in black and white. Known liar. Ill repute. Her past had been weaponized. The ink looked like poison. "They are not just coming for the land," Silas said, his voice cold and final. "They are coming for you to get to the land." Clara looked up at him. She didn't cry. The fear had burned away, leaving something harder in its place. "Then let them come," she said. The Laramie County Courthouse in Cheyenne was a monument to the New Order of the West. It was built of stone and imported marble, designed to look like justice. But to Silas Mercer, it felt like a colder kind of wilderness. The air inside was stale, smelling of floor wax, old paper, and the sweat of men fighting for their lives or their money. Silas sat at the defendant's table, his hands resting on the polished oak. He wore his Sunday suit, the wool scratching against his neck. Beside him sat Arthur Finch, a lawyer Silas had hired from Denver, A man with ink-stained fingers and eyes that missed nothing. Across the aisle, Jude Coulter sat with his legal counsel. Coulter looked relaxed, leaning back in his chair, whispering to his attorney, a local man named Pendergast who had a smile like a spread trap. The hearing was technically a preliminary inquiry into the charges of cattle theft and brand alteration, but everyone in the room knew it was a trial of character. The gallery was full. Men from the Stock Growers Association, curious townspeople, and the vultures of the press had all crowded in to see the fall of the hermit rancher and his fallen woman. Judge Holloway banged his gavel. He was a man with a face like a dried apple, weary of lies but bound by procedure. "Mr. Mercer," the judge rumbled, "your counsel may proceed." Finch stood up. He did not bluster. He laid out the facts with surgical precision. He presented the fence wire, cut with commercial cutters. He presented Silas's ledger books, kept in Silas's own meticulous hand, documenting every calf born and branded for the last decade. He presented the testimony of Tom Brady, who swore on a Bible that the calves found near the creek were Mercer's stock, their mothers grazing nearby. It was solid evidence. In a sane world, it would have been enough, but Pendergast rose like oil separating from water. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, "ledgers can be forged. Wire can be cut by anyone. What we have here is a pattern of behavior. A man living in isolation, desperate to maintain his holdings, falling under the influence of questionable company." He called his witnesses. They were men Silas had never seen, or drifters he had fired years ago. They told polished lies. They claimed they had seen Mercer riders hazing Coulter cattle. They claimed Silas had bragged about taking what was his. Then Pendergast called Clara Reyes to the stand. The room went quiet. Clara stood up from the bench behind Silas. She was wearing the same dark blue dress she had worn to the ball, her hair pulled back severely. She walked to the witness chair, her boots clicking on the hardwood. She felt the eyes. It was the ballroom all over again, but stripped of music and champagne. These eyes were not just curious. They were judging. They were waiting for her to break. They were waiting for the hysterical Latin woman or the seducer to appear so they could justify their prejudice. Clara sat. She placed her hands in her lap, clasping them tight to stop the trembling. "State your name," the bailiff said. "Clara Reyes." "Miss Reyes," Pendergast began, leaning against the railing. "You are currently employed as the housekeeper for Mr. Mercer?" "I am." "And before that, you were employed in Laramie?" "Yeah, and why did you leave that employment, Miss Reyes?" Clara felt a cold sweat prickle under her collar. The trap was open. "I left because the situation had become untenable," she said, her voice low but steady. "Untenable." Pendergast smiled. "Is it not true that you were accused of theft? That you were dismissed for improper conduct with the master of the house?" "Objection," Finch shouted. "Irrelevant. It goes to credibility." "Your Honor," Pendergast shot back, "the defense rests on the idea that Mr. Mercer is a man of integrity, but he harbors a woman known for manipulation, a woman who destroys households." The judge waved his hand. "I will allow it, but tread carefully. Mr. Pendergast." Pendergast turned back to Clara. "Did you, or did you not, leave Laramie in the middle of the night to avoid the sheriff?" Clara looked at the jury box. 12 men. None of them looked like they would understand the terror of a woman cornered in a pantry. "I left because I was not safe." Clara said, "I stole nothing." The accusations were lies told by a man trying to cover his own sins. "Ah," Pendergast said, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "Always the victim, aren't we? It is never your fault, just like it is not Mr. Mercer's fault that his neighbor's cattle keep ending up in his herd. It seems you have a contagious effect, Miss Reyes, wherever you go. Decent men seem to lose their way." Clara felt the room shrinking. The words hit her like physical blows. Contagious. Improper. Manipulation. It was the voice of every person who had ever looked down on her, magnified by the authority of the law. She felt the instinct to shrink, to weep, to beg for mercy. That was what they wanted. They wanted the breakdown. She looked at Silas. He was sitting at the defense table, his body turned toward her. He was not looking at the judge or the lawyer. He was looking at her. His face was pale with fury, but his eyes were steady. They held hers, anchoring her. "I won't let them decide who you are," he had said. Clara took a breath. She sat up straighter. She let the shame wash over her and fall away, leaving only cold, hard truth. "I am not on trial here," she said clearly. Her voice carried to the back of the room. "And neither is my past, Mr. Mercer is a good man being hunted by a greedy one. You can paint me as a villain if it pleases you, sir. But it does not change the brands on those calves." Pendergast sneered, opening his mouth to strike again. But before he could speak, a commotion started at the back of the room. "Your Honor," a voice called out. "I have something to say." The judge frowned. "Order. Who is this?" A woman stepped forward from the gallery. It was Mrs. Gable, the mayor's wife. She was wearing a hat with a stiff black feather and carrying a parasol like a weapon. She walked past the bailiff, who tried to stop her. "I am a witness," Mrs. Gable announced. The judge looked confused. A witness to the cattle theft? A witness to the character of the accused? And the character of the accuser, Mrs. Gable said. She looked at Jude Coulter, who suddenly looked very uncomfortable. "Let her speak," Finch said quickly. "Mrs. Gable took the stand. She smoothed her skirts. "I was at the stock growers' ball," she said. "I saw Miss Reyes, and I saw Mr. Coulter and his friends. I heard the lies they were spreading that night, and I saw Mr. Sterling, a known associate of Mr. Coulter, assault Miss Reyes verbally." She turned to look at the jury. "Mr. Mercer behaved with honor," Mrs. Gable said firmly. "He defended a woman who was being hunted for sport by men who should know better. If Miss Reyes says she left Laramie to escape a predator, I believe her, because I saw the wolves in this town try to tear her apart." And she stood her ground with more dignity than any man in this room. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Mrs. Gable was the definition of Cheyenne society. Her word was gold. Pendergast looked like he had swallowed a lemon. But Finch was not done. "If it pleases the court," Finch said, holding up a piece of paper, "we have also subpoenaed the bank records of Deputy Hatcher." The deputy, standing near the door, went rigid. "These records show 3 distinct deposits in the last month," Finch said, waving the paper, "each for $100, a sum far exceeding a deputy's pay. The source of the drafts is the Granite Creek Land and Cattle Company." Finch turned to Coulter. "That is your holding company, is it not, Mr. Coulter?" Coulter's face went gray. "And," Finch continued, "we have a sworn affidavit from a ranch hand who overheard Deputy Hatcher discussing the Mercer problem with Mr. Coulter's foreman, specifically mentioning that the law could be bent for the right price." The judge's face turned a darker shade of red. He looked at Deputy Hatcher. He looked at Coulter. "This hearing is recessed." Judge Holloway barked. "Bailiff, take Deputy Hatcher into custody pending an investigation into these financial irregularities. Mr. Coulter, you will not leave the city. It wasn't a verdict. It wasn't total victory. But it was a crack in the wall. The corruption had been dragged into the light." Silas stood up. He looked at Clara, who was stepping down from the witness box, her legs trembling. He walked over to her and offered his arm. "You were magnificent," he whispered. "I was terrified." She answered. They did not have time to celebrate. As they walked down the courthouse steps, a rider on a lathered horse skidded to a halt in the slushy street. It was Billy, the young rider from the Mercer Ranch. He was missing his hat, and there was dried blood on his jacket. "Boss!" Billy shouted, sliding off the horse. Silas was there in 2 strides, grabbing the boy's arm. "What happened? They hit us," Billy gasped. "Last night, while you were gone. 20 men. They didn't just cut fences. Boss, they raided the remuda. They took the horses. They shot Dutch in the leg. Tom?" Silas demanded. "Tom is holding the house." But they left a message, burned into the barn door. "What did it say?" Billy looked at Clara, then lowered his eyes. It said, Evict the woman or we burn the rest." Silas's face turned to stone. He looked at the courthouse behind him, then at the darkening sky. The law was slow. Violence was fast. While they were arguing over ledgers, Coulter had made his move on the ground. "We are going back," Silas said. He turned to Clara. "You stay here. I will get you a room at the hotel. It is not safe." "No," Clara said. Silas looked at her. "Clara, they are threatening to burn the house. They are shooting men. And if I stay here?" Clara asked, her voice rising. "I hide in a hotel room while you bleed for me. I wait for a telegram telling me you are dead." "I cannot protect you there," Silas said. "I do not need you to protect me. Silas, I need to be with you. I am not a piece of china to be put on a shelf. If that is my home, then I am going back to it. I will not be the reason you fight alone." Silas looked at the fire in her eyes. He saw the terror there. Yes, but he also saw a fierce, unyielding loyalty. She was right. He couldn't leave her behind. Not anymore. "Get the horses," Silas told Billy. The ride back to the ranch was a descent into hell. The weather had turned. A norther was blowing in, dropping the temperature until the air felt like sandpaper in the lungs. The wind howled across the plains, driving ice crystals into their faces. They rode through the night, driven by fear. The darkness was absolute, a solid black wall that swallowed the road. Silas rode lead, trusting his horse to find the path. Clara rode behind him, wrapped in every blanket they had, her hands frozen to the reins. She thought about the message burned into the barn door. Evict the woman. They were using her as the excuse. They wanted to make the men of the ranch hate her. They wanted to make Silas choose between his land and her. "I will not let them win," she thought, bowing her head against the wind. "I will not be the weakness." They reached the ranch just before dawn. The wind had died down, leaving a heavy, ominous silence. The main gate was hanging off its hinges. The corral where the horses were kept was empty, the rails smashed. Tom Brady came out of the main house as they rode up. He was limping, his face gray with fatigue, carrying a Winchester. "Glad to see you, boss," Tom said. We didn't know." "Dutch?" Silas asked, swinging down from the saddle. "He is in the bunkhouse. Bullet went through the thigh. Clean, missed the bone. Clara, you best get inside. It is cold enough to freeze words." The ranch went into survival mode. It was no longer a business, it was a fortress. Silas had the men board up the lower windows of the main house. They moved the remaining supplies into the cellar. They set up firing positions in the loft of the barn. The men worked in shifts, sleeping in their clothes, guns by their sides. The atmosphere was tight, brittle, like a wire stretched to breaking. That evening, the house was dark except for the glow of the stove in the kitchen. Clara was melting snow for water. The pump had frozen. Silas came in from the perimeter check. He looked haggard. His eyes were red-rimmed, his movements stiff. He hung his rifle by the door and walked to the stove, holding his hands out to the heat. "They are out there," he said quietly. "I can feel them. They are waiting for the storm to break." Clara watched him. She saw the weight pressing down on his shoulders, the guilt. He blamed himself for everything, for the raid, for Dutch's leg, for the danger she was in. She walked over to him. She didn't ask if he wanted coffee. She didn't ask about the plan. She reached out and took his face in her hands. His skin was cold, rough with windburn and stubble. He flinched slightly, then leaned into her touch, closing his eyes. "Silas," she whispered. He opened his eyes. They were dark, full of a desperate, aching hunger. "I should have made you stay in Cheyenne," he rasped. "If you had left me, I would have walked," Clara said. She rose up on her toes. She didn't pull away this time. She pressed her mouth to his. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was desperate. It tasted of cold air and fatigue and fear. Silas made a sound low in his throat, a groan of surrender. His arms went around her, crushing her against him. He lifted her, pressing her back against the warm edge of the counter. His hands were everywhere, in her hair, on her waist, gripping her as if to make sure she was solid. Clara's hands tangled in his coat, pulling him closer. The desire that had been simmering for months boiled over, hot and sharp. For a minute, there was no siege. There were no cattle thieves. There was only the heat of his mouth, the roughness of his beard, the heavy, driving rhythm of their hearts. Silas pulled back, gasping for air, his forehead resting against hers. His hands were shaking. "Clara," he whispered, I can't stop if we keep going." Clara looked at him, her lips swollen, her eyes wide. She wanted him to keep going. Every instinct in her body screamed for it. But the house was full of armed men. The windows were boarded up. Death was waiting outside. "Not yet," she whispered, smoothing his hair back. "Not like this. Not in a siege." Silas nodded, his breathing ragged. He stepped back, putting a foot of space between them. It felt like a mile. He looked at her, searching her face. "Why did you come back?" he asked. "Really?" Clara leaned against the counter, wrapping her arms around herself. "Because I am tired. Silas, I am tired of running. I am tired of living my life as if I have to earn the right to be in a room. I have to be useful. I have to be quiet. I have to be invisible. If I do those things, maybe they will let me stay." She looked at him, tears shimmering in her eyes. "I don't want to earn it anymore. I just want to be—" Silas reached out and took her hand. He squeezed it hard. "You don't have to earn anything with me," he said. "You are not a guest here. Clara, you are not help. You are my home." The words hung in the air. "You are my home." It was a bigger confession than love. Love was a feeling. Home was a place where you didn't have to hide. "I am terrified," Silas admitted. "I have not been afraid of a fight in 20 years, but I am terrified of losing you. If they hurt you—" "They won't," Clara said, fierce. "We won't let them." The next morning, the escalation arrived. It didn't come with gunfire. It came with the official stamp of authority. The sun had barely risen when the lookout shouted, "Riders coming!" Silas grabbed his rifle and ran to the porch. Clara followed, staying low in the doorway. A group of 10 men rode up the drive. They weren't hiding. In the lead was Jude Coulter, wearing a heavy fur coat. Beside him was a man with a tin star, not Deputy Hatcher, but a man from the neighboring county jurisdiction, a man Silas didn't know. Behind them were 8 hired guns, men with hard faces and Winchesters resting on their saddles. Silas stepped out, his rifle held across his chest. Tom, Brady, and Billy appeared at the corners of the house, weapons leveled. "That is far enough," Silas shouted. Coulter smiled. It was a cold, victorious smile. "Morning. Silas, I see you are prepared for a war. Shame we aren't here for one." "State your business," Silas said. "This is Marshal Davies," Coulter said, gesturing to the lawman. "He is here to execute a court order." The marshal stepped his horse forward. He looked nervous, eyeing the barrels of the guns pointed at him. "Mr. Mercer," the marshal said, pulling a folded paper from his coat. "I have a writ of seizure here from the district court, based on the sworn testimony of theft and brand alteration. The court has ordered the immediate impoundment of your herd pending the full trial. Mr. Coulter has been deputized to assist in the collection." "Impoundment?" Silas spat. "You mean theft. You are going to drive my herd onto his land, and I will never see it again." "It is a legal order." "Mercer," the marshal said, "if you resist, you are in contempt. And if you raise a weapon against a deputized officer—" He nodded toward Coulter's men. "They have the right to use lethal force." Silas looked at the men. They were itching for a fight. They wanted him to shoot. If he fired the first shot, they would kill him and burn the house. And it would all be legal. "Let me see the order," Silas said. The marshal hesitated, then rode forward and handed the paper to Silas. He backed his horse away quickly. Silas unfolded the document. It looked official. It had the seal of the court. It had the signature of Judge Holloway. It authorized the seizure of all livestock bearing the Mercer brand, to be held in trust by the plaintiff. It was a death sentence for the ranch. If they took the herd, Silas was bankrupt. He stood there, his hands shaking with rage. He looked at Coulter, who was watching him with gloating eyes. "You bought the judge," Silas said. "I merely expedited the process." Coulter replied, "Hand over the keys to the gates, Silas, or we take them." Silas felt the weight of the rifle. He calculated the odds. 10 men. He had 4. He could take Coulter, but the marshal, shooting a marshal was a hanging offense. Clara stepped out onto the porch. "Silas, let me see," she said. "Get back inside," Silas hissed. Clara ignored him. She took the paper from his hand. She didn't look at the legal jargon. She looked at the details. She had spent years doing household accounts, deciphering the messy handwriting of butchers and grocers, looking for the penny that didn't add up. She knew that the truth was always in the small things. She scanned the document. She looked at the date. She looked at the signature. Then she looked at the bottom, where the clerk's seal was stamped. Her eyes narrowed. She looked up at Coulter. He was watching her with amusement. "Reading is a useful skill, Miss Reyes," Coulter mocked. "But I'm afraid it won't help you now." Clara looked at the paper again. Her heart hammered against her ribs. It was small. It was tiny. But it was wrong. "Silas," she whispered. "What? Look at the clerk's stamp," she said, pointing to the bottom corner. "It says, Laramie County District Court, Clerk J. T. Miller. So, J. T. Miller died 3 months ago. Clara said, I saw the obituary in the paper when we were in town. The new clerk is a woman, Mrs. Higgins." Silas looked at the stamp. He looked at Clara. "Are you sure?" "I am sure," Clara said. "I remember because the obituary said he was survived by 12 grandchildren." Silas looked back at the paper. If the stamp was from a dead man. The document hadn't been processed by the court clerk. It had been forged. It was a high-quality forgery, likely done on stolen stationery, but they had used an old stamp. Silas looked up. The rage in his chest cooled into something sharper, more dangerous. He folded the paper slowly. "Is there a problem?" "Mercer?" the marshal asked. Silas handed the paper back to Clara. "There is a problem." "Marshal," Silas said, "but it isn't mine." He racked the lever of his rifle. The sound loud and metallic in the frozen air. "Tom," Silas shouted. "Yeah, boss, if any man on a horse moves a muscle, shoot him." The ranch yard froze. The wind began to pick up again, blowing snow off the roof in thin, white sheets. The guns were up. The standoff had begun. And in Clara's hand, the piece of paper fluttered like a white flag that was about to turn red. The wind shrieked across the open yard, tearing at the brims of hats and stinging exposed skin with ice. The standoff at the Mercer Creek Ranch had frozen into a tableau of potential violence. 10 men on horses faced 4 men on the porch. And in the middle of it all stood Clara Reyes, holding a piece of paper that weighed no more than a dry leaf, but carried the force of a landslide. Silas kept his rifle leveled at the marshal's chest. He did not look at the paper. He looked at the man holding the authority of the state. "Explain yourself, Marshal," Silas said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the wind. The marshal's horse danced nervously. Sensing the tension, "I do not have to explain anything to you, Mercer. That is a court order. It is a forgery," Clara said. Her voice was clear, pitching high enough to carry over the stamping of hooves. She stepped forward to the edge of the porch railing. She did not look at Silas for permission. She looked directly at the hired guns sitting in their saddles behind Coulter. "The clerk's stamp on this document is signed by J. T. Miller," Clara announced, holding the paper up. "Mr. Miller died of a stroke 3 months ago. I read his obituary in the Cheyenne Leader. The current clerk is Mrs. Higgins, unless the dead are signing writs of seizure in Laramie County. This paper is a fraud." A murmur went through the line of riders. These were hard men, willing to fight for money, but they were not willing to hang for counterfeiting court documents. Hanging for cattle rustling was a risk of the trade. Hanging for fraud was a fool's death. Jude Coulter's face twisted. He spurred his horse forward. "She is lying," Coulter shouted. "She is a known liar. Are you going to listen to a Mexican maid over a marshal?" "I am listening to the facts," Silas said. He did not lower the rifle. "And the fact is, Coulter, you are sweating." Silas turned his head slightly toward Billy, the young rider crouched behind a rain barrel with a shotgun. "Billy," Silas said, keeping his eyes on the marshal. "Take the back trail. Ride for the railhead. Wire the sheriff in Cheyenne. Tell him we have a marshal serving papers signed by a ghost, and bring the deputy from the Carbon County line. He is honest. Billy didn't hesitate. He scrambled back and vanished around the corner of the house. A moment later, the sound of hoofbeats thundered away to the west, muffled by the snow. Coulter's eyes went wide. He pulled a revolver from his holster. "Stop him!" Coulter screamed at his men. "Shoot him!" Not a man moved. The hired guns looked at the house, bristling with the rifle barrels. They looked at Silas Mercer, who stood like a statue of judgment. And they looked at the paper in Clara's hand. "If you fire," Silas said, his voice dropping to a gravelly rumble, "you are not enforcing the law. You are committing murder during the commission of a felony. And I promise you, I will empty this magazine into the first man who lifts a barrel." The marshal looked at Coulter. He looked at the paper. He slowly lowered his hands to the pommel of his saddle. "We will wait," the marshal said. "No," Coulter snarled. "We take the herd now. We wait," the marshal barked. "If the paper is good." "Coulter, we have nothing to fear from the sheriff." "Do we?" Coulter went silent. His face was a mask of impotent fury. He knew the clock had just started ticking, and it was counting down to his ruin. The hours that followed were a grueling endurance test. The snow began to fall harder, dusting the shoulders of the men and the manes of the horses. No one dismounted. To dismount was to surrender the advantage. Silas stood on the porch, his arms aching from the weight of the rifle, but he did not lower it. Clara stood beside him. He had told her to go inside 3 times. She had refused 3 times. "I am not leaving you," she had said. So they stood together, watching the steam rise from the horses' nostrils. Coulter tried to break them. He rode back and forth along the line of his men, talking loud enough for the porch to hear. "Look at him," Coulter jeered, pointing at Silas, hiding behind a woman's skirts, the great Silas Mercer. "You know what they say in town. Silas, they say you lost your nerve years ago. They say you are just an old man playing house with a whore who—" Silas didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He let the insults wash over him like the wind. He knew what Coulter was doing. Coulter wanted Silas to snap. He wanted Silas to fire the first shot in anger. If Silas fired, the marshal could claim self-defense. "Don't listen," Clara whispered. Her hands were gripping the railing so hard her knuckles were blue. "I hear nothing but the wind," Silas murmured back. The cold bit deeper. One of the hired guns took a flask from his pocket and drank. The discipline was fraying. The horses were shivering. Then, Clara spoke up again. She didn't speak to Coulter. She spoke to the men. "You are cold," she said. Her voice was not taunting. It was practical. "There is coffee inside, hot stew. If you turn your horses around and ride away, no one has to die here today for a lie that isn't yours." "Shut up," Coulter screamed. One of the riders, a weathered man with a scarred nose, looked at Clara, then he looked at Coulter. "She is right about the stamp." "Ain't she, Jude?" the man asked. "Miller is dead. I remember the funeral. It is a clerical error," Coulter snapped. The rider shook his head. "That ain't an error. That is a trap, and I ain't stepping in it." He turned his horse. "Where you going?" Coulter demanded, reaching for his gun. "I am going home," the rider said. "I didn't sign on for forgery." He rode off. It started a cascade. 2 more men turned their horses, then 3. They were mercenaries, loyal only to the coin, and they could smell that the coin was counterfeit. "Come back!" Coulter yelled, his voice cracking. "Cowards!" Within 10 minutes, only Coulter and the marshal remained. And then, on the ridge line, a silhouette appeared. Then another. Billy rode down the slope, and beside him was a man with a distinct white hat, Deputy Linus from Carbon County, and behind them were 4 Texas cattlemen who had been at the railhead, men who knew Silas Mercer's reputation and had ridden hard to back him. Coulter looked at the reinforcements. He looked at Silas. "It is over." "Jude," Silas said. The marshal cursed and threw his hands up. "I was misled," he shouted immediately. "I was given false documents by Mr. Coulter. I demand protective custody." Coulter stared at the marshal with pure hatred. Then he looked at Clara. He saw the cause of his destruction. The woman he had mocked. The woman he had tried to crush because she was an easy target. She was standing there, unbroken, holding the proof of his crime. A madness took him. "If I go down," Coulter screamed, "I take the trash with me." He spurred his horse, not away from the house, but toward the porch. He raised his revolver, aiming not at Silas, but at Clara. Silas moved faster than thought. He didn't fire his rifle. Coulter was too close, and the angle was bad. He dropped the rifle and vaulted over the railing, launching himself into the air. He collided with Coulter as the horse reared. The gun went off, the bullet splintering the porch roof. Silas and Coulter crashed into the snow. The horse bolted. They rolled in the freezing mud, a tangle of limbs and rage. Coulter was younger, but Silas was fighting with the strength of a man defending his soul. Coulter tried to bring the gun around. Silas slammed his forearm into Coulter's throat, pinning him to the frozen earth. He grabbed Coulter's wrist and twisted. There was a sickening pop. Coulter screamed and dropped the gun. Silas drew his own revolver. He pressed the barrel into the soft flesh under Coulter's jaw. "Do it!" Coulter wheezed, blood on his teeth. "Kill me! Show them what you are!" Silas's finger tightened on the trigger. The rage was a red haze in his vision. He wanted to end it. He wanted to wipe this man from the earth for daring to threaten Clara. "Silas!" The voice pierced the haze. It was Clara. She was standing on the steps, her hand outstretched. "Silas! No, he is not worth it. Do not let him make you a murderer." Silas froze. He looked up at Clara. He saw the terror in her eyes, but also the trust. She believed he was better than this. He looked down at Coulter. He saw a pathetic, broken man who had nothing left but spite. Silas slowly eased the hammer down. He stood up, holstering his gun. He spat into the snow beside Coulter's head. "You are right," Silas said. "He isn't worth the bullet." Deputy Linus rode up, swinging down from his saddle with a pair of irons. "Jude Coulter," the deputy said, hauling the groaning man to his feet. "You are under arrest for fraud, cattle theft, and attempted murder. Marshal, you are coming too. We have some questions about your vetting process. The arrests were messy." Coulter screamed threats until he was gagged. The marshal wept. The hired guns who had fled were pursued by the Texas cattlemen, though most would likely vanish into the territories. But as the sun began to set, painting the snow in shades of violet and bruised purple, the yard was finally empty of enemies. Silas stood by the porch, wiping mud from his face. His coat was torn. His knuckles were raw. He felt a trembling start in his legs. The adrenaline crash. He leaned against the post, taking deep, shuddering breaths. A hand touched his arm. He turned. Clara was there. She wasn't playing the stoic anymore. She was shaking, her teeth chattering, the delayed shock rolling over her like a wave. Silas opened his arms. She stepped into them, burying her face in his torn coat. She sobbed. Loud, jagged sounds of release. Silas held her tight, wrapping the coat around her, resting his chin on the top of her head. "I thought he killed you." She wept. "When the gun went off, I thought you were dead. I am hard to kill." Silas whispered into her hair. "I am too stubborn to die." They stood there for a long time, holding each other up while the wind died down and the stars began to prick through the clouds. They were battered, exhausted, and freezing, but they were standing. The scandal did not vanish overnight. Small towns have long memories, and people hate to admit they were wrong. But the trial that followed was a sensation. With Coulter's record seized, the depth of his corruption was laid bare. He had been stealing land and cattle for years, bribing officials, and ruining anyone who stood in his way. The revelation shamed the town of Granite Creek. The men who had laughed at Silas in the saloon now looked at their boots when he walked by. The women who had sneered at Clara crossed the street to avoid her, not out of superiority, but out of embarrassment. But some things changed. 3 weeks after the arrest, Silas and Clara rode into town. They went to the Mercantile. As they walked up the steps, Mrs. Gable was coming out. She stopped. She looked at Clara. There was a tense moment of silence. Then, "Mrs. Gable nodded. "Good morning, Miss Reyes," she said. Clara stood tall. "Good morning, Mrs. Gable." It was a small thing, a nod, a greeting, but in the social language of the West, it was a treaty. They walked into the store. The clerk, the same one who had sneered at Clara months ago, hurried over. "Mr. Mercer," the clerk said nervously. "Can I help you with anything?" Silas looked at the man. He placed a hand on the small of Clara's back. He did not hide her. He did not stand in front of her. He stood beside her. "Miss Reyes will be handling the accounts for the ranch from now on," Silas said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "Anything she orders, you put on my bill. Any check she signs, you honor as if it were my own. Is that understood?" The clerk swallowed hard. "Yes, sir. Absolutely, sir." Silas turned to Clara. "What do we need, Clara?" Clara looked at the ledger on the counter. She looked at Silas. She saw the pride in his eyes. He was giving her power. He was giving her a voice in the world that had tried to silence her. "We need 50 pounds of flour," Clara said steadily, "and new fencing wire. And coffee, the good kind." The winter finally broke in April. The snow retreated to the high peaks, leaving the valley floor a brilliant, aching green. The creek ran high and clear, washing away the memory of the poison. The ranch was busy. New calves were dropping, stumbling onto wobbly legs in the sunshine. The fences were mended, but the real change was inside the house. The oak chair no longer sat under Clara's doorknob at night. She had moved it back to the corner. One evening, after the supper dishes were cleared, Silas and Clara sat on the porch. The air was cool, smelling of wet earth and sagebrush. Clara watched the sunset bleeding red over the mountains. She felt a strange lightness in her chest. For years, she had believed that love was a trap. She had believed that to love a man was to give him the power to destroy you. She had feared dependency more than hunger. But she looked at Silas. He was whittling a piece of cedar, his hands moving with slow, relaxed precision. He wasn't trying to own her. He had fought for her, bled for her, and then handed her the keys to his kingdom and told the world to respect her. He didn't want a servant. He didn't want a prisoner. He wanted a partner. "Silas," she said. He looked up. "Yes, you asked me once to come to you when I was ready to stay." Silas went still. The knife stopped moving on the wood. "I did." Clara turned to face him. She smoothed her skirt. She was terrified, but it was a different kind of fear. It was the fear of jumping off a cliff, hoping the water was deep enough. "I am not going anywhere," she said. "This is my home, and you are my home." Silas set the knife in the wood down on the railing. He stood up. He walked over to her. He didn't grab her. He waited. Clara stepped into his space. She reached up and unbuttoned the top button of his coat. Then the second. "I am tired of waiting," she whispered. Silas let out a breath that sounded like a man surfacing from deep water. He took her face in his hands and kissed her. It wasn't desperate like the kiss in the kitchen. It was slow. It was deep. It was a promise signed in breath and skin. He picked her up. She wrapped her legs around his waist, burying her face in his neck. He carried her inside, kicking the door shut behind them against the night. The house was not silent that night. It murmured with the sounds of two people unlearning loneliness. There was no shame in the dark. There was only the heat of skin, the roughness of calloused hands turning gentle, and the profound, shattering relief of being fully known and fully wanted. It was not a fantasy. It was clumsy at times, and fierce at others. A negotiation of bodies that had been solitary for too long. But when they fell asleep, tangled together under the heavy quilts, Clara did not dream of running. Morning came with a pale, golden light. Clara woke first. She lay still, listening to the steady rhythm of Silas's breathing. She looked at his arm thrown over her waist, heavy and possessive in sleep. She slipped out of bed, dressing quietly. She went downstairs to the kitchen. She built the fire in the stove. She put the coffee on to boil. She opened the ledger book on the table. She was not just the woman who warmed his bed. She was the woman who balanced the books. She was the woman who hired the men. She was the woman who kept the world running. Silas came down 20 minutes later. He was dressed for work, his hair wet from washing. He stopped in the doorway, watching her. Clara looked up. She didn't blush. She didn't look away. She smiled. "Coffee is ready," she said. Silas walked over. He kissed the top of her head, his hand resting on her shoulder for a moment, grounding himself. "Morning," he said. "Morning." He poured a cup and went to the door. He opened it and stepped out onto the porch. Clara followed him, mug in hand. They stood side by side, leaning against the railing. The valley stretched out before them, miles of wild, indifferent country. It was a harsh land. There would be more blizzards. There would be droughts. There would be men like Coulter who thought power gave them the right to take. The world had not become a fairy tale. The town still whispered. The work was still hard. But as Silas looked at the horizon, he felt a peace he hadn't known in a decade. He looked at Clara. She was watching a hawk circle the thermal currents. Her eyes narrowed against the sun, her profile sharp and proud. She wasn't going anywhere, and neither was he. "Ready for the day?" Silas asked. Clara took a sip of coffee. She looked at the vast, open sky. She looked at the man beside her. "Yes," she said, "I believe I am. Thank you for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed the journey of Silas and Clara through the storms and struggles of the American West. I would love to hear from you. Please leave a comment below telling me where you are listening from and what you thought of the ending. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to From Wild West for more stories of survival, romance, and the grit of the frontier. Share your thoughts in English, and I look forward to bringing you the next adventure.